Alright, shalom, shalom, shalom. First thing and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rahak Wadash. Secondly, I want to give double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone who taught me this truth in righteousness and in sincerity. The title of this lesson is going to be a simple way to identify the tribe of Ephraim. Once again, a simple way to identify the tribe of Ephraim. And this is going to be a second half or a part 2 of me. First I did the tribe of Judah, a brief little way to identify who the, tribe of Judah is today. And, in this section, I'm going to be doing a brief, breakdown of how to identify the tribe of Ephraim today. So I'm going to start this lesson off with the book of Genesis, chapter 49, verse 22. It reads, but before I read, the tribe of Ephraim, that is referring to, in modern day terms, with the modern day nationalities, Ephraim is the so-called Puerto Ricans, and their main dwelling is in the land of Puerto Rico, a very rich land, a very fruitful land, just like them. But this is the book of Genesis chapter 49 verse 22, and it reads, Joseph is a fruitful bow. Now, when you go into the word bow, it means son, grandson, child, member of a group, right? So that's the point. Joseph, aka Ephraim, because I'm not gonna grab it, but brothers, you could go to Genesis 48 from verse 10 on down, and you can read about pretty much Ephraim. Even though he was the younger brother, he was chosen to receive a greater blessing than his older brother, and ultimately he received the representation of the house of Joseph. So Ephraim represents the house of Joseph, which is why the name Joseph is interchangeable with Ephraim. When you go into the book of Revelation chapter 7 and verse, I could start up a little bit. I'm gonna start up from the top, verse 4. Now this is going into the sealing of the 144,000, which are the elect out of the nation of Israel that has been chosen to be saved from the judgment of the wicked that is going to come upon all of the wicked and all those who follow, But starting off at verse 4, and I heard the number of them which were sealed, and there were sealed 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel. Right, so speaking of the children of Israel, 12,000 from each tribe. It says of the tribe of Judah, which is the head tribe, were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Reuben were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Gad were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Asher were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Nephthalim were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Manasseh, which is going into Manasseh, were sealed 12,000. That's the older brother of Ephraim, And it says, of the tribe of Simeon were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Levi were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Issachar were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Zabulon, which is Zebulon, were sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Joseph were sealed 12,000. And that's the point, Joseph is mentioned. And then it says of the tribe of Benjamin were sealed 12,000. That's all the tribes, But in certain points in the scriptures, you see Ephraim mentioned regarding the 12 tribes, when it comes to that specific tribe, which is the tribe of Joseph or the tribe of Ephraim. You see either of those names used. And in this specific passage, Ephraim is the only name you don't see. It literally names all 12 tribes, So Manasseh is mentioned, as his own tribe, and Joseph is mentioned, obviously showing you Ephraim is in that specific lot, that specific tribe, it's interchangeable, Ephraim, I'm at Joseph's younger son, which received the greater blessing, being the representation of the house of Joseph. But when you going back to Genesis 49 and 22, rereading, Joseph is a fruitful bow, even a fruitful bow by a well. Right, now this is like, kind of read between the lines kind of language, because the Lord is leaving us clues, and hints to where you will find this people, so they're a fruitful people, a fruitful son, even a fruitful son by a well. Now when you look at the land of Ephraim, let's grab it right quick. Salakia, I meant to say the land of Puerto Rico. But when you look at the land of Puerto Rico, it's surrounded by water. Just look, the land of Puerto Rico is literally surrounded by water, and all of that water, right along with its geological circumstances, it causes this land, from the temperature, to the history of this land, it causes this land to naturally be very fruitful. It has bioluminescent water, water that literally glows at night, But when you see this land, it's literally surrounded by water, a fruitful well. Now, when you go to Google, I searched up, pretty much the fruitfulness of the land of Puerto Rico before, the colonization, before Esau came and, defiled the land and, established his order and his way upon the land of Puerto Rico. It was way more, rich and fruitful before Esau came and, put his spirit within it. Now, it says prior to Taino colonization, which were, the so-called Puerto Ricans before they were reclassified, but ultimately their true nationality is Ephraimite, Israelites from the tribe of Ephraim. But it says Puerto Rico's land prior to Taino's colonization, before the Puerto Ricans were colonized, it says Puerto Rico's land was lush and fertile, characterized by abundant natural resources and diverse ecosystems. It says, here's a glimpse into the pre-Taino fruitfulness. So it says dense forest. The island was nearly 100% forested, featuring a diverse native tree flora from about 547 species. Right, so the whole land being covered in trees, showing that water, that well, it has a lot to do with the fruitfulness of that land. The land within itself is a well of riches, a fruitful well, because that water helps that well produce all manners of resources and substance, that is used. But it says rich biodiversity. The island is home to nearly 300 plant and animal species in endemic to the territory, including the endangered Puerto Rican parrot. Right, so you got certain animals, dwelling over there, because they understood, especially before, the whole defiling of that land, that land was natural, it was undefiled, it was a certain natural order that was being held on that island. You had Ephraim over there, of course they wasn't perfect, and they was going off, but they was doing better when it comes to nature and keeping up with the laws of nature according to Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shai than Esau. He came over there and straight, destroyed, setting up all manners of warehouses and factories and stuff like that. But it says very ecosystems. Puerto Rico boasted a stunning array of natural habitats, including rainforests, mangroves, bioluminescent bays. And when you go into that, that's the water that glows at nighttime, like on Avatar. But it says, and one of the largest underground cave systems in the world, an extremely fruitful well of a land. It says abundant wildlife. The land supported a variety of endemic species, including birds, amphibians, and reptiles, such as, I'm not going to pronounce that, a small frog recognized by its distinctive call. It says navigatable waters. The surrounding waters provided fertile fishing grounds and supported marine life like sea turtles and manatees. Right. So the water's extremely fruitful, the land extremely fruitful, the ecosystem extremely fruitful. The diversity, very, very dense, very, very fruitful, It says natural resources. The island's diverse geology, including volcanic and plutonic rocks, as well as limestone deposits, provided a variety of resources and supported unique ecosystems like the karst region. It says early inhabitants dating back to approximately 27,000 to 23,000 BC utilized these resources, engaging in foraging, fishing, and rudimentary horticulture with plants like corn and cassava. Archaeological evidence, I know how to pronounce that. I don't know why I'm mispronouncing that. Archaeological, I think that's how you pronounce that. Evidence suggests that these early societies understood how to prepare and detoxify certain plants, like, I don't know how to pronounce that, to make them edible. Right, so we've always been connected to the land, because we are ultimately of this land. This land was created for us, to serve us in many, many different ways. It's just the earth has been given into the hand of the wicked, so everything has been defiled. But, it was created for righteousness, and the children of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahweh Shai, they know how to operate within this earth, when it comes to certain things, you know. And this shows right here that those people, them Tainos, were indeed, you know, Israelites, you know. They were keeping certain laws, you know. They were not living like savages and animals. Even though they were going off in certain manners, you know, they had a certain order to them as well. So going back to Genesis 49 and 22, Joseph is a fruitful bow, even a fruitful bow by a well, whose branches run over the wall. Now, when it comes to the fruitful nature of Ephraim, the so-called Puerto Ricans, you know, there's been, you know, many different migrations, you know, and expansions when it comes to the reproduction of the so-called Puerto Ricans, which is the Ephraimites, you know, and I'm gonna grab that. Now, this is the AI overview. I just, you know, to keep it simple, I searched up all major Puerto Rican migrations. So we just go into some of them on the AI overview. It reads, the major Puerto Rican migrations to the U.S. mainland occurred primarily in the mid-20th century, particularly after World War II, with the largest wave known as the Great Migration. These migrations were driven by factors such as economic hardship on the island, increased job opportunities in the U.S., and the availability of affordable air travel. So it was many different causes to why the so-called Puerto Ricans migrated, you know, mainly to Babylon the Great, which is America, you know. But it says, here's a more detailed look at the major periods and destinations. It says early 20th century, pre-World War II, while Puerto Ricans were granted U.S. citizenship in 1917, migration to the mainland was relatively limited before World War II. Some Puerto Ricans did settle in New York City and other northeastern cities, establishing early communities, and they grew rapidly, you know, in New York City especially. You know, it's something called the Puerto Rican problem when it comes to, you know, how they grew in New York City, you know, and brothers can correct me if I'm wrong, you know, but I'm, you know, pretty sure, you know, there was a big situation when it comes to the so-called Puerto Ricans and their growth, you know, in a short period of time within New York City. But this is going into the Great Migration post-World War II. This period from the late 1940s to the 1960s saw a massive influx of Puerto Ricans to the mainland, especially New York City, the primary destination, with the Puerto Rican population increasing dramatically. Right, so that's the spirit. This is going into what I was speaking about. So it was after World War II when they really, you know, dramatically increased in their numbers in New York City. It says other northeastern cities, Philadelphia, Boston, and cities in New Jersey, Newark, Jersey City, Patterson, and Connecticut, Hartford, New Haven also saw Puerto Rican migration. Right, so the so-called Puerto Ricans, you know, Ephraim, they migrated all over, you know, when it comes to Babylon the Great, you know, and that's going into, let's go back to it, that's going into whose branches run over the wall, you know, because they ran over their wall, you know, in their land, and they came over, you know, migrated into the land of America, you know, and all over. You know, you got Ephraim all over the world. You know, we are scattered. That's part of the curses. But you had major migrations, you know, with the so-called Puerto Ricans, which are the Ephraimites, migrating, you know, and increasing in numbers. Now, when you go into the book of Hosea, chapter 9 and verse 13, it reads, Ephraim, as I saw Tyrus, is planted in a pleasant place. So once again, going into that fruitful land, you know, that well, you know, that fruitful bow, you know, even a fruitful bow by a well, you know, that land of Puerto Rico being surrounded by, you know, rich waters. You know, you got the coral reefs, you got the animal life, you know, the marine life, you know, before, especially before Esau Edom, you know, put his, you know, filth, you know, all on that land, you know, established his establishments upon that land, you know, put his vibration upon that land. It was extremely fruitful, you know, just like the people upon it. And Esau, he began to defile the land and the people, you know, making the land and the people less fruitful. And that's what this is going into. It says, Ephraim, as I saw Tyrus, is planted in a pleasant place. You know, and that's also showing you that Joseph, which is a fruitful bow, even a fruitful bow by a well, is speaking of Ephraim, because this is pretty much saying the same thing. Ephraim is planted in a pleasant place, you know, that fruitful bow by a well, you know, because the land is fruitful, and Ephraim himself, the so-called Puerto Ricans, they are fruitful, you know. But it says, but Ephraim shall bring forth his children to the murderer, you know, Esau Edom. You know, when you go into it, I'm about to grab an article, but you know, this is going into the sterilization of Ephraim, you know, them pretty much enforcing sterilization upon the Puerto Rican women, you know, so that they could stop bringing forth children, because their numbers were growing so rapidly and they were so fruitful. You know, it was let me just go into it. Now this is going into the article, you know, the beloved brother Yaquab, you know, the water bro, you know, for this article. But this is some beautiful information going into, you know, the murderers, you know, that targeted the tribe of Ephraim, you know, specifically through trying to sabotage one of their gifts, which is being fruitful, you know, extremely fruitful. It says sterilization of Puerto Rican women. Right here it says young women were key to labor force. Problem was pregnancy. Right. So they needed the young women for labor, but they were always getting pregnant because Ephraim is very fruitful. You know, so it says result, massive sterilization program. Women coerced into sterilization, them being the weaker vessel, being deceived, you know, through all manners of deception to, you know, get sterilized, you know. And one of the main ways they were sterilizing was tying the tubes, you know, birth control pills, things like that, you know, to stop the process of you being able to conceive a child, you know. It says by 1968, 1/3 of women childbearing age were sterilized. Right. So 1/3 of the women of childbearing age, you know, they were sterilized, meaning they couldn't have children, you know? And that's defeating their whole purpose. One of their main purposes is to bring forth the children of the men of Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahweh Shai. And the Puerto Ricans, so-called, the tribe of Ephraim, that is one of their gifts. I am fruitful. That's what Ephraim means, And then the tribe, Joseph, he will add, So when it comes to the tribe of Joseph / Ephraim, the spirit, that was given to that tribe is increasing, adding. Specifically when it comes to seed, children being very fruitful. That's why they were given that fruitful land with glowing water. You can see the stars. You can see the stars way better there. A lot of areas is less light pollution. Especially before Esau, touching that land. All of the trees and everything over there, it was just a whole lot more pure. Now, it says in 1937, Puerto Rico enacted Law 116, the last eugenic sterilization law passed under United States territorial jurisdiction. Soon after, a program endorsed by the U.S. government began sending health department officials to rural parts of the island advocating for sterilization. So they was going around promoting it, trying to make it seem like a good thing. The Puerto Rican government fully supported this program as it attributed overpopulation to the island's high levels of poverty and unemployment. This was ultimately used to push that narrative of we need to sterilize, we need to limit your numbers, because of this, because of that, But the ultimate reason was because they wanted to have better slaves, more labor, more hands to labor, And the fruitful nature of Ephraim was getting in the way of that, Women pregnant and then having to take care of the children, Esau wasn't trying to hear that. But it says, with the growth of American corporations on Puerto Rican soil and factory work, they also wanted to integrate women into the workforce more fully and childbearing was seen as an obstacle to that. Right, that's the spirit, because that's pretty much what I was just saying, Esau wasn't trying to go for, oh, we got a family we got to take care of. Oh, I'm pregnant, I can't work. Nah. Oh, you want to keep getting pregnant? Y'all want to be so fruitful? We go cut your goddamn, I don't know what the exact name of that tube is, but we go tie your tubes so that you can't have children. We go give you this pill, to sterilize you, but it says, with the growth of American corporations on Puerto Rican soil and factory work, they also wanted to integrate women into the workforce more fully, and childbearing was seen as an obstacle to that. In fact, sterilization efforts were so prevalent that they were integrated into women's work lives. Family planning clinics could be found in factories that provided free sterilization thanks to the USAID grant. Sterilization was so common that it was simply referred to as LA Corporation Operation, which means the operation. And it reads, in 1982, the documentary La Operación was made about this. It is estimated that between 1947 to 1948, 7% of Puerto Rican women were sterilized, and by 1956, 1 out of 3 women suffered the same fate. So it was increasing over time, and it has had a big impact on the Puerto Rican numbers today, because they're still pushing that sterilization today. But it says between the 1930s and the 1970s, approximately 1/3 of the childbearing population of Puerto Rico was sterilized, making it highest rate of sterilization in the world. Why is that the case? Because Ephraim has the highest birth rate in the world. They are the most fruitful when it comes to, reproducing their seed in the world. They were given that blessing, So that's literally the reason why they are being sterilized at the highest rate in the world, But this is going into that scripture that I just read, Ephraim shall bring forth his children to a murderer. It reads, but Ephraim shall bring forth his children to the murderer. It says in verse 14, give them, O Lord, what wilt thou give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breast. Right. The breast only fill up for the child, but if you ain't having no children, you sterilized, you can't even conceive, your breast have no reason to produce any milk, because you're not getting pregnant, your body develops and prepares while you're going through them stages of pregnancy, forming that milk, getting your body prepared for when that baby is ready to suck on that nipple. But Ephraim, as it just said, is the biggest target in the world when it comes to sterilization for a reason, because they are that fruitful bow, which goes into a fruitful son, meaning they have a lot of fruit, Another way to say fruit is seed, the seed is within fruit, when you look at fruit in the world, fruit has seeds, so when it comes to being fruitful, your fruit bears seed, and that's what Ephraim brings forth, lots and lots of seed, lots and lots of children. That's why they are being targeted, and this is a curse. It says, verse 14, give them, O Lord, what wilt thou give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breast. Right, so not being able to have children, that is what's going on. So when it comes to the land, being very rich, we just seen in that article, Esau, he done came in there and established himself, established corporations, and turned it more into a business, zapping and sapping all of the resources from that land and defiling it, destroying the peace and the harmony, which affects the fruit of that land, the health of that land, because it's living, and they're pushing nothing but death right now in that land. So that's why that land isn't as fruitful as it was. But to begin, when Ephraim was inhabiting that land as the Taínos, before the colonizers, that land right along with the inhabitants, which were the so-called Puerto Ricans, everything on that land was extremely fruitful, That's why the first thing they did was came against that fruit, and started trying to chop it down. but from the land, being extremely fruitful, in Genesis 49, that fruitful bow, even a fruitful bow by a well. Now, this is the book of Hosea, chapter 7 and verse 8, and it reads, and I'm going to close it out on here. It reads, Ephraim, he has mixed himself among the people. Once again, going into him running over that wall in Genesis 49, He has migrated and expanded throughout the earth, and Babylon the Great specifically, Ephraim has migrated all throughout Babylon the Great, which is America, and he has, mixed and mingled throughout all of the nations and throughout all of the rest of the 11 tribes, But it says Ephraim is a cake not turned, So when it comes to that, if you have a cake or a pancake, you put it on the stove, you let it cook on one side for a minute till it get nice and dark brown, and you don't flip it, but you look at the bottom half that was on the bottom of the skillet getting nice and toasted, and you look at the top half that started bubbling, the little holes that it get, but you didn't flip it, it get lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. When you look at the so-called Puerto Ricans, there's not one specific look for Puerto Ricans. Their looks range and, they vary, They have a very versatile look when it comes to their color, and their attributes. Now, when you go, I just searched up what Puerto Ricans look like, and when you go into some of these pictures, as you can see, some of these look like, you could call them a so-called African American, especially, this little young girl right here, they don't all look the same, like when you got the Afro Puerto Ricans, and that's going into them being mixed, as that scripture was just saying, being mixed, because they have been mixed and mingled throughout all of the nations, including those of their nation, which is Israel, with the so-called African Americans being brought to the land of Puerto Rico, and being enslaved right alongside these people right here, which are their brothers, But do you see this? Cake unturned. Look at the differences. They're not all looking the same. Different colors, different shades, different sizes, But you got Ephraim, all over the world, mingling, being fruitful. Even though Esau has still to this day been targeting, Ephraim, been coming for their gift, which is producing seed, still to this day, they are fruitful. But, you can just see it, like Ephraim, they are that cake unturned, You got the phrase Afro Puerto Rican for a reason. You go from looking so-called Caucasian to looking like a so-called African or African American when it comes to the Puerto Ricans, because their skin color literally goes from that light to that dark. And it says in verse 9 right here, strangers has devoured his strength. Right. Those strangers that came into the land of Puerto Rico and diminished the life there, cutting down trees, establishing factories and different labor institutions, defiling nature, taking away natural trees that gave off fruit, doing all manners of wicked things, you know. So strangers have devoured his strength, right along with coming for his literal blessing, in him being fruitful in his seed.
Better, so you can use
and Salakia, because this ain't play the ad ever, and I want to play these dumb ads. But yeah, Esau literally has come for Ephraim's complete strength by coming for his fertility, coming for him being able to reproduce with his woman, which is a very fertile woman, and he has a very fertile seed. And when you put those two together, you got grass, it's gonna grow, and it's gonna grow abundantly, But those strangers, Esau, Edom, which is our enemy, they came in and they have devoured the strength of the land. They have devoured the strength of the people, the so-called Puerto Ricans, still to this day targeting, their women mainly, through abortion pills, getting abortions in general, tying their tubes, all of these manners of things. It says, and he knoweth it not, right? Because Ephraim, they lackadaisical to these things. Now in these days, they are beginning to be woken up. The Lord is bringing that hammer down on the northern kingdom, which Ephraim, the so-called Puerto Ricans, they are the head of the northern kingdom. But the Lord is beginning to judge them, so they're beginning to wake up now. But, Ephraim has been completely blind to what Esau has been doing right under his nose, But it says, and he knoweth it not. Yea, gray hairs are here and there upon him, yet he knoweth it not. So it's obvious, Esau is making it obvious, but Ephraim still, he's just oblivious. But that was really the point of this lesson. I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on Ephraim in this part, kind of going into, the blessings that he was given, when it comes to his fruitfulness of his dwelling, the fruitfulness of his body, when it comes to the man of Ephraim and the woman of Ephraim, them being extremely fruitful and fertile, and how they have been the main target, the so-called Puerto Ricans, for sterilization, which is going into stopping the women from being able to conceive children, because they were getting pregnant so much that it was coming in the way. It was getting in the way of work, their work numbers. And that shows that you got to take the greatest measures for the greatest person. And when it comes to producing children, Ephraim is the greatest. So they had to do the greatest amount of sabotage and use the greatest amount of deception to, try to diminish and ultimately destroy the blessing that was given to the tribe of Ephraim, But that was the point of this lesson, Ephraim is a cake unturned. They range from all different shades on the color spectrum, from, pale to very, very dark brown, and they are very fruitful. They're in a very fruitful land, and they have been they have been mingled among the people, you know. They have migrated, you know, as I brought out, you know, and through that, they have continued to grow, and they have continued to inhabit, you know, the earth, you know, and they ultimately will continue to be here up until Yahweh Shai comes back, you know, with the elect of them being beamed up and delivered, and the rest of them having to come back through the loins of those Ephraimites that were saved, you know, to be fruitful in the kingdom abundantly, you know, with no sabotage, with no limits. You know, it's going to be complete fruitfulness in the kingdom. But I hope you brothers and sisters was edified, and I was able to bring this point out clearly. And until next time, Shalom.